Thousands gather in Melbourne, Sydney, Gold Coast and across Australia in orchestrated protests against COVID-19 vaccines restrictions. Thousands of people have again converged in Australian cities to protest COVID-19 restrictions and vaccination requirements. A group known as Millions March Against Mandatory Vaccination organized protests in more than 24 cities and towns across the country. Protesters of all ages from children to adults gathered in major protests in Melbourne, Sydney and the Gold Coast. Thousands gathered in Melbourne to protest vaccine mandates on Saturday, hours after Victoria recorded 1,252 COVID-19 cases and 5 deaths. It is the third consecutive weekend protesters have gathered in Melbourne city centre, and it comes a day after all authorised workers in the state were required to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 to continue working on site. Much of the action has been sparked by the state's contentious pandemic bill, which stalled in the upper house last week. The crowd gathered outside state parliament at midday before moving onto Bourke Street Mall. They waved Australian, Aboriginal and Eureka flags, as well as those of other countries including Greece, Lebanon and Macedonia, and held signs with slogans such as "Fear God Not Dan," "End Segregation Now" and "Kill the Bill," in reference to the pandemic legislation before Parliament. Several bus and tram routes have been affected by the protest, with motorists urged to allow plenty of extra time if travelling into the city. Thousands also attended a protest against mandatory vaccination being held in Sydney's Hyde Park. An Indigenous smoking ceremony has been held, and Waltzing Matilda was sung at the protest. Federal MP Craig Kelly has been in attendance. Many were draped in Australian flags, while others held signs with messages including "Never Lock Down Again." Less government, more freedom and no one can stop the awakening of humanity. There were positive signs in the New South Wales COVID response on Saturday. It continued a decline of cases with 235 compared to 276 and 261 recorded on Thursday and Friday respectively. For the third straight day, no deaths were recorded. In Queensland, protests have been held in the Sunshine Coast, Toowoomba and the Gold Coast. One Nation leader Pauline Hanson has attended the protest at Broadbeach on the Gold Coast. "I said to Prime Minister Scott Morrison last week when I had a half-an-hour conversation with him on the phone, he said your bill doesn't comply with the Constitution. I said, well go out and bloody well change it, so it does," she told protesters, who cheered and chanted in response. People are seen during protest against the Queensland government's mandatory vaccination laws on the Gold Coast, Saturday, November 27, 2021. One Nation leader Senator Pauline Hanson is seen speaking to the crowds during protest against the Queensland mandatory vaccination laws on the Gold Coast. Her One Nation colleague Malcolm Roberts also attended. A sign at the protest showed pictures of Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk and former Chief Health Officer Jeanette Young, suggesting they had mad cow disease. In Adelaide, hundreds of demonstrators assembled at Hindmarsh to protest vaccination mandates and COVID-19 rules. They say they are standing against the epidemic of prejudice and are fighting for their lost jobs. Some say they are not anti-vaxxers, while others say their children's lives are in danger if they get the jab. Protesters have assembled at Hindmarsh to stand against vaccination mandates and COVID rules. Some say they are not anti-vaxxers, while others say their children's lives are in danger if they get the jab. 7 NEWS Adelaide at 5:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. The protests are being held amid a backdrop of global alarm over a new COVID-19 variant, Omicron. The emergence of the variant has prompted Australia to shut its borders to 9 southern African countries and suspended all flights from that region amid growing concerns about the new variant. Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt said all flights have been immediately suspended for 2 weeks from South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Lesotho, Eswatini, the Seychelles, Malawi, and Mozambique. Any Australian citizens or dependents who have been in those countries in the past 14 days must go into mandatory quarantine, and non-citizens who have been Southern Africa will be banned from entering Australia.